The cabin pressure felt suffocating, though Sarah Chen knew that was impossible at this altitude. Flight 447 from San Francisco to Las Vegas hummed with the mechanical indifference of 1,000 daily journeys. But for Sarah, this was no ordinary flight. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each passing minute as she stared out the window of seat 12F, her knuckles white from gripping the armrest. Below, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a vast, golden nothing that somehow felt more forgiving than the chaos of her mind. The handcuffs around her left wrist were subtle. The briefcase attached to them was reinforced titanium, invisible to the casual observer. Nobody on this aircraft had any idea they were sitting 3 rows away from technology that military strategists had estimated could cost America's adversaries billions in defensive upgrades. 6 years of her life had been condensed into that case, 6 years of sleepless nights, abandoned friendships, a broken engagement, and countless moments of doubt that nearly destroyed her. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the window. She barely recognized herself anymore. The woman looking back wore wire-rimmed glasses and a navy blazer, her black hair pulled into a severe bun. Her face was pale, etched with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. At 34 years old, she looked 50. But it wasn't the physical toll that frightened her most. It was the knowledge of what she'd created and the absolutely terrifying responsibility she now carried. She glanced sideways at the businessman in seat 12. He'd been snoring for the past 40 minutes, his head tilted awkwardly against the window, a spreadsheet abandoned on his lap. His Rolex caught the cabin light. He probably made 6 figures, probably had a corner office somewhere, probably felt important. He had no idea that the woman next to him could potentially reshape the balance of global military power. The thought made her stomach turn. 3 days ago, everything had been different. 3 days ago, Sarah had been alone in her basement laboratory in a secured government facility in Sunnyvale, California, basement being a generous term for the underground bunker that served as her workspace. The room was climate-controlled, soundproof, and monitored by cameras that were supposedly only accessed by her security clearance handlers. She'd been refining her algorithms, deep learning protocols, when the reinforced door had suddenly hissed open. Colonel Marcus Webb had appeared like a ghost, his uniform immaculate, his presence somehow both commanding and unsettling. Sarah had never met him before that moment, though she knew his reputation. The man had 30 years of military aviation experience, had commanded combat squadrons in 3 different countries, and possessed the kind of operational intelligence that only came from seeing actual warfare. His visit had been unscheduled, unannounced. "Major Chen," he'd said without preamble, "we need to talk about what happens if your algorithm actually works." That single sentence had sent ice through her veins. She'd spent weeks wondering this exact question in the solitude of her bunker. The algorithm she'd developed was designed to process aerial combat scenarios at speeds human pilots couldn't match. It could analyze radar data, predict enemy movements, calculate optimal intercept vectors, and feed real-time tactical recommendations faster than any neural network had ever processed warfare data. In theory, it should work. In theory, it could give American fighter pilots an unprecedented advantage. But theory and reality were separated by an ocean of variables she couldn't fully predict. Webb had explained the situation with brutal clarity. A hostile drone incursion had occurred 72 hours earlier near the Canadian border. An unidentified aircraft had penetrated U.S. airspace, evading standard detection protocols for 47 seconds before being manually intercepted. The pilots had nearly died. The F-22 Raptors, the most advanced fighters ever built, had come dangerously close to being insufficient. "We need your algorithm operational," Webb had said. "Not in 6 months, not in 3 months, now, can you do it?" Sarah had hesitated. The algorithm wasn't battle-tested. It had been through thousands of simulations, but simulations weren't reality. Real combat involved variables that no programmer could fully anticipate, Equipment failures, pilot error, unexpected atmospheric conditions, the raw, chaotic unpredictability of actual warfare. "I'm not sure," she'd answered honestly. Webb's expression hadn't changed. "That's why you're coming to Nellie's. The Titan Squadron wants to meet you. They want to see what you've built, and they're going to decide whether they trust their lives to your code." Which brought her to this moment, suspended in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, handcuffed to 6 years of obsession, flying toward an unknown future. Sarah's phone buzzed silently against her thigh. She retrieved it carefully, making sure the businessman didn't wake. The message was from an unknown number, encrypted. "Nellie's, 2 hours. Security detail at baggage claim. Trust nobody else." She deleted it immediately. Looking around the cabin, Sarah suddenly noticed the details she'd been too anxious to register before. The woman in seat 11F, reading a romance novel, who kept glancing sideways at the bathroom. The man in seat 12G, across the aisle, who'd been on his laptop for the entire flight. A laptop that was angled slightly away from her, but she'd noticed him watching her reflection in the cabin windows. The flight attendant who'd checked on her twice despite Sarah not having ordered anything. Federal protection. She was being protected, and now she could see the invisible architecture of it. Sarah realized her hands were shaking again. She pressed them flat against her thighs and tried to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A technique her therapist had taught her years ago, before Sarah had stopped going to therapy because she couldn't discuss her work with anyone. The aircraft began its descent, and Sarah felt the familiar pressure change in her ears. Below, the lights of Las Vegas glittered like fallen stars, and beyond them, somewhere in the darkness of the desert, the Nellie's Air Force Base waited. The F-22 squadron waited. The moment that would either validate everything she'd sacrificed or destroy her completely waited. She looked down at the briefcase handcuffed to her wrist, then back out at the desert. Somewhere out there, Colonel Webb had told her, there were pilots willing to put their lives in the hands of her code. Pilots who'd survived impossible odds, who'd trained for decades, who'd experienced actual combat, and who were now desperate enough to trust an algorithm written by a woman they'd never met. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump. Sarah Chen closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Whatever happens next, there's no turning back." She had no idea how accurate those words would prove to be. The fluorescent lights of the Sunnyvale underground facility hummed their eternal, maddening tune. Sarah Chen had stopped noticing the sound 3 years ago, the way humans stop noticing their own heartbeat until something goes wrong. She was elbow-deep in her algorithm's neural networks, running the latest batch of simulations through a processing cluster that consumed enough electricity to power a small town. The time was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt exactly like every other Tuesday for the past 72 months. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. She'd forgotten to eat lunch. Again. These details were irrelevant to her. What mattered was the elegant cascade of mathematical logic flowing across her monitors, each line of code a small victory against the uncertainty that still haunted her work. The algorithm was responding beautifully to the latest combat scenario, a theoretical engagement against a hostile aircraft attempting to penetrate protected airspace. In the simulation, her code had calculated an optimal intercept vector in 1.3 seconds. A human pilot would have needed at least 8. Sarah's secure phone rang, not buzzed, actually rang with sound. This had never happened before. Her heart seized. Secure phones didn't ring unless something was catastrophically wrong, and catastrophically wrong in her world meant a security breach or a national emergency. She'd been briefed on the protocols. She knew what this meant. Her hands felt numb as she reached for the phone, her mind already spinning through worst-case scenarios. "Chen," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Major Chen, this is Colonel Webb." The voice was crisp, military precise, and carried the weight of command. "I'm at your facility's entrance. I need you to prepare a secure room for a briefing. Immediately. What you're about to hear is classified at the highest levels." 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Colonel Marcus Webb in the secure conference room, a chamber within a chamber, surrounded by Faraday cages and encryption protocols that would have impressed the NSA. Webb was a man carved from stone and authority, his uniform bearing insignia that indicated decades of service and combat experience. His gray eyes held no warmth, only the penetrating gaze of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions and would do so again without hesitation. At 2:43 hours, 72 minutes ago, an unidentified aircraft breached U.S. airspace near the Alaska-Canada border. Webb began without preamble. Not Canadian airspace, American airspace. The aircraft avoided detection for 47 seconds before being visually identified by an F-22 pilot conducting routine patrol. Sarah's stomach dropped. 47 seconds. In modern warfare, that was an eternity, enough time to launch weapons, identify targets, cause catastrophic damage. The aircraft was intercepted without incident, Webb continued, his jaw tightening. But the response time was inadequate. Our current air defense systems nearly failed to detect it. Our pilots, despite their exceptional training, nearly failed to intercept it. Had that aircraft been hostile, had it been armed, we would be having a very different conversation right now. We would be discussing how American lives were lost due to systemic failures in our defense capabilities. Webb pulled out a classified folder and slid it across the table. Inside were technical specifications, radar data, engagement vectors, and a series of photographs showing an aircraft that looked almost alien in its design. "We don't know what that was," Webb said quietly. "We have theories. Some believe it was a probe, reconnaissance to test our response capabilities. Others believe it was a system malfunction that caused erratic behavior. But what we do know is that our current defense systems are insufficient. Our pilots, good as they are, cannot react fast enough when faced with certain threats." Sarah's eyes scanned the documents with growing comprehension. "You want me to analyze the engagement data?" "I want more than that." Webb leaned forward, his intensity increasing. "I want to know if your algorithm could have prevented this." The question hung in the air between them like a suspended blade. Sarah had spent 6 years developing her algorithm in isolation, never knowing if anyone actually believed in it, never knowing if the military would ever seriously consider implementing it in actual operations. Theory was safe. Simulations were controllable. But the suggestion that her code might prevent real deaths, that it might be the difference between national security and catastrophic failure, that was responsibility on a scale she'd never fully considered. "The data shows the aircraft's behavior pattern," Sarah said slowly, pointing to the radar traces. "If my algorithm had been processing this engagement in real time, it would have flagged the anomaly approximately 8 seconds before visual confirmation. That would have cut your response time from 47 seconds to 39 seconds. 93% reduction in detection time," Webb said flatly. "And if this aircraft had been hostile, 8 additional seconds to react, 8 seconds to deploy defensive countermeasures, to alert other aircraft, to launch an interception. 8 seconds might mean 8 pilots coming home to their families instead of not coming home." Webb stood abruptly and walked to the door. He paused without turning around. "Your algorithm isn't theoretical anymore, Major Chen. It's operational necessity. I need you to prepare for full integration testing with an operational fighter squadron." "How soon?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer by his tone. "Immediately. There's a helicopter waiting to take you to Nelly's Air Force Base. You have 20 minutes to secure your work and grab personal items. Minimal luggage. You're not coming back to this facility for several weeks." Sarah's mind spiraled. Weeks, operational testing, with real pilots flying real aircraft. "Colonel," she said, her voice barely steady, "my algorithm hasn't been tested under actual combat conditions. The variables are now real instead of theoretical." Webb interrupted, turning to face her. 6 years ago, you wrote in your proposal that the only way to truly validate your code was to deploy it in operational conditions with experienced pilots. You're getting that opportunity. The question is, do you believe in your own work? The question devastated her, because Sarah had spent 6 years in her basement, working in isolation, telling herself that her algorithm would work if given the chance. But now that the chance was being offered, now that actual human lives hung in the balance, her certainty evaporated. I believe in it, she said, because backing away now would be a betrayal of every sacrificed relationship, every missed meal, every midnight session spent refining her code. Then you need to believe in it under conditions that actually matter, Webb said. The Titan Squadron is the most decorated fighter group in the United States Air Force. They've flown combat operations in multiple theaters. They've lost pilots. They've killed enemies. And tomorrow, you're going to convince those pilots that your algorithm is worth their lives. The helicopter ride to Nellie's was loud, turbulent, and seemed to last forever. Sarah sat in the cargo hold, watching the desert rush beneath her, her encrypted briefcase still handcuffed to her wrist. She thought about the 47 seconds that an unknown aircraft had penetrated American airspace. She thought about the 8 seconds her algorithm might have saved. She thought about the pilots who were alive only because nobody had found a way to compress reaction time far enough. And she realized that Webb was right about one thing. She no longer had the luxury of doubt. 8 pilots might depend on her code working perfectly under pressure. The Nellie's runway appeared beneath them like a scar on the desert floor. Everything was about to change. The Nevada heat hit Sarah like a physical force as she descended from the helicopter, the rotor blades creating a maelstrom of dust that stung her face. Colonel Webb was waiting on the tarmac, his sunglasses reflecting the harsh desert light. Behind him stood a line of F-22 Raptors, those magnificent war machines sitting dormant in their hardened shelters like sleeping predators. Sarah had seen photographs of these aircraft countless times, had studied their specifications, had built her entire algorithm around the capabilities of their avionics systems. But standing on the same tarmac, as actual operational fighters felt surreal, terrifying, and overwhelming all at once. "Welcome to Nellie's, Major Chen," Webb said, offering no warmth. "The Titan Squadron is waiting for you in the ready room. I should warn you, they're not particularly happy about this arrangement." They walked across the sun-baked tarmac toward a nondescript concrete building that housed the squadron's operational center. Sarah's laptop bag felt impossibly heavy on her shoulder, and her legs moved like those of someone walking to their own execution. She'd prepared presentations before, had defended her research at academic conferences, had briefed high-ranking military officials. But this was different. These men, and she suspected they would almost exclusively be men, had actual blood on their hands. They'd lost friends in combat. They'd made split-second decisions that determined whether they lived or died. And now she was supposed to convince them that an algorithm, written by a woman in a basement bunker, could improve on decades of hard-won experience and instinct. The ready room fell silent the moment she entered. The Titan Squadron sat sprawled across worn leather chairs, their flight suits bearing insignia and patches that represented combat deployments across 3 continents. There were 8 of them, 8 of the most lethal aerial warriors in the American military. They looked at her with the kind of uniform skepticism that suggested they'd been briefed about her arrival and had collectively decided she was a waste of their time. Captain James Rodriguez stood at the center of the group, his frame lean and muscular, his face weathered by sun exposure and something else, the particular hardness that came from killing and nearly being killed. His eyes were sharp, assessing, and utterly dismissive. A scar ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, a white line against tanned skin. Behind him, the other pilots shifted with the casual arrogance of men who knew they were the best at what they did. "Major Chen," Colonel Webb announced, "this is the Titan Squadron. Gentlemen, this is Major Sarah Chen, whose algorithm we discussed earlier. There was no applause, no welcoming gestures, just the heavy silence of professional military men facing someone they perceived as a threat to their autonomy. "So, this is the computer scientist," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a drawl that suggested southwestern roots. He stood and walked toward her with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving hers. "The one who's supposed to teach us how to fly our multi-billion-dollar fighters better than we've been doing for the last 15 years. Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not here to teach you how to fly, Captain. I'm here to present a tool that might enhance your decision-making capability during high-stress engagements." "A tool," Rodriguez repeated, tasting the word like it tasted bad. "You know what my tool is, Major? This." He held up his hand, his fingers splayed. 23 years of military aviation experience, 3 combat deployments, 47 confirmed hostile engagements, 15 pilots whose lives I've saved because I made the right decision at the right moment. Those fingers have pulled triggers that sent missiles through the air at 6 times the speed of sound. Can your algorithm do that?" "No," Sarah said quietly, "but it can help ensure that you know when to pull that trigger before the enemy knows you've locked onto them." One of the other pilots, a man with sergeant stripes, laughed. "She's got an answer for everything. Webb, with all due respect, sir, this is a waste of our training time. We should be flying, not sitting in a classroom being lectured by someone who's probably never heard a jet engine at full throttle." The insults continued, each one a tiny blade cutting at her confidence. Sarah had expected resistance, had even intellectually prepared for it, but the actual experience of standing in front of these men while they systematically dismantled her credibility was devastating. She could feel tears threatening behind her eyes and fought them back viciously. If she cried, they would destroy her completely. These were men who'd trained their entire lives to recognize weakness and exploit it. "Gentlemen," Colonel Webb's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Major Chen has spent the last 6 years developing this algorithm. She's one of the most accomplished computer scientists in the Department of Defense. You will treat her with the respect that rank and position deserve." "With all respect, sir," Rodriguez said, and there was genuine deference in his tone when addressing Webb, though his eyes remained hard when they flickered back to Sarah. "I respect the Major's credentials, but respect for a civilian's achievements and trust in that civilian's code with my life are 2 very different things." "Then prove it," Sarah heard herself say. The room went completely still. Every eye in the ready room turned toward her. She hadn't planned to say anything confrontational. Her strategy had been to present data, to show simulations, to gradually build credibility through evidence. But something about Rodriguez's condescension had triggered a response she couldn't suppress. "What?" Rodriguez asked, his voice dangerous. "You said you don't trust my algorithm because you haven't tested it," Sarah continued, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her system. "So prove that you're right. Let me show you what it can do. If it fails, if it can't demonstrate real capability, then you never have to trust it. But if it works, if it shows something valuable, then maybe you could at least consider the possibility that someone with different expertise than you might have something useful to contribute." Rodriguez's jaw tightened. "You're proposing what exactly?" "A simulation scenario," Sarah said, forcing confidence into her tone. "You in the cockpit, real controls, full F-22 avionics. I'll run my algorithm against combat data you've personally experienced. You can watch how it processes the same engagement you lived through. You can see how it compares to your actual decisions. And if your algorithm makes a mistake," Rodriguez asked softly, "then you'll know exactly how it fails, and you'll have legitimate grounds to reject it entirely." The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind Rodriguez's eyes, the weighing of pride against the possibility of finding something that might actually improve his squadron's capability. 1 hour, Rodriguez finally said. "Get your equipment set up in the sim room. If your algorithm doesn't impress me, I'm filing a report recommending this entire project be scrapped." As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah realized she was trembling. Colonel Webb placed a hand on her shoulder, the first gesture of support she'd received since arriving at Nellie's. "You just made a very dangerous move," he said quietly. "If Rodriguez decides your algorithm is inadequate, he'll convince this entire squadron to reject it. And if the Titan squadron rejects it, no other squadron will touch it." "Then I guess I better make sure it doesn't fail," Sarah whispered. She had less than 60 minutes to prepare the most important demonstration of her life. And somewhere in that equation was the very real possibility that Captain James Rodriguez would see her code in action and decide it was worthless. The simulation room waited. The algorithm waited. Everything she'd sacrificed for was about to be tested against the most skeptical audience she could possibly face. There was no margin for error. The simulation room was a cathedral of military technology, a full-motion F-22 cockpit mounted on hydraulic actuators, surrounded by screens displaying real-time radar data, engagement parameters, and the infinite complexity of modern aerial combat. Sarah had 45 minutes to configure her algorithm to interface with the simulator's avionics, and her hands moved with the focused precision of someone whose entire future hung in the balance. She downloaded the algorithm's core protocols onto a secured laptop, running redundant systems to ensure zero latency. The last thing she could afford was a technical failure that made her code look incompetent. Each keystroke felt like a heartbeat, each line of code a promise she was making to pilots who didn't believe in her. Rodriguez arrived exactly on time, already in his flight suit, moving with the coiled confidence of a predator stepping into familiar territory. Behind him came the rest of the Titan squadron, all 8 pilots filing into the observation room with drinks and expressions of barely concealed skepticism. One of them, a sergeant named Patterson, actually smirked at her. The message was clear. They expected a spectacular failure. "We're ready when you are, Major," Rodriguez said, settling into the simulator cockpit with the familiarity of muscle memory. His hands automatically moved through the pre-flight checklist, checking instruments, arming systems, performing the ritualistic dance that every pilot had done thousands of times. "I'm going to run a scenario based on actual combat data," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This simulation uses real engagement parameters from verified military archives. The scenario involves an aerial engagement in a contested environment with multiple hostile contacts." "Which engagement?" Rodriguez asked, his voice casual but his eyes suddenly alert. Sarah hesitated for just a fraction of a second. This was the moment she'd been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. 3 years ago, Northern Afghanistan, your engagement designation was Titan 27. The observation room went absolutely silent. Rodriguez's hands froze mid-movement on the control stick. When he looked back at her through the simulator's canopy window, something had changed in his expression, something that might have been anger or shock or both. "That's classified," he said quietly. "How do you have access to classified combat data from?" "My security clearance includes access to verified combat engagements," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady. "When the Pentagon approved my project, they provided me with every available aerial combat scenario from the last decade. I specifically analyzed your engagements because you're the most experienced pilot in your squadron. I wanted to understand how you think under pressure." "You analyzed my kills," Rodriguez said, and the words hung like an accusation. "I analyzed your decisions," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. Your engagement in Afghanistan lasted 14 minutes. During that engagement, you made 43 tactical decisions. My algorithm has been trained to identify the decision points that led to your successful outcomes." Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, then turned back to face the simulator screens. Run the scenario. The simulation activated with a soft hum. Suddenly, Rodriguez was back in that Afghan sky 3 years ago, flying at 28,000 feet, his radar showing multiple hostile contacts closing on his position. The simulation recreated every detail with terrifying accuracy. The radio chatter, the threat warnings, the grinding pressure of knowing that people were actively trying to kill him. Sarah activated her algorithm simultaneously. Data streams appeared on her monitoring screens, her code processing the same radar information Rodriguez was seeing, analyzing the geometry of the engagement, calculating intercept vectors, predicting hostile intentions. And then the algorithm began feeding recommendations directly to the simulator's HUD, painting tactical overlays that Rodriguez could follow. The first hostile contact appeared on his scope. Rodriguez instinctively banked left, exactly the move he'd made 3 years ago. But Sarah's algorithm suggested a course deviation of 8 degrees further left, with a descent of 2,000 feet. Rodriguez hesitated for just a moment, then adjusted his flight path to match the algorithm's recommendation. The simulation's hostile aircraft, following pre-programmed parameters based on actual engagement data, flew directly through the space where Rodriguez would have been without the algorithm's suggestion. Holy, Rodriguez breathed, but his voice was cut off by the next engagement scenario. Contact after contact appeared, each one a moment from that day when he'd flown alone against overwhelming odds. And each time, Sarah's algorithm provided recommendations that were simultaneously different from and clearly superior to the decisions Rodriguez had made 3 years ago. The algorithm wasn't second-guessing his tactical instincts. It was enhancing them, showing him what would have happened if he'd had access to one more layer of analytical capability. By the 7th contact engagement, Rodriguez was flying with barely restrained intensity, his hands moving in perfect sync with the algorithm's recommendations. By the 10th engagement, something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't fighting the algorithm anymore. He was collaborating with it, adding his intuition and experience to the algorithm's computational power. The simulation ended with Rodriguez having successfully defeated all 34 hostile contacts that his real-world counterpart had faced 3 years ago. The display screen showed a perfect engagement record. Rodriguez sat in complete silence for several long seconds. When he finally removed his helmet, his face was pale, his expression impossible to read. He climbed out of the simulator cockpit and walked towards Sarah. The entire observation room held its breath. "Show me," he said quietly. "Show you what?" Sarah asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Show me the moment where your algorithm predicted my decision that saved my wingman's life. The moment where I made the choice that kept Thompson alive." Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard, bringing up the specific engagement data. There, timestamp 11:47 a.m. local time, where Rodriguez had made a seemingly counterintuitive decision to climb instead of descend. It was a choice that violated standard engagement doctrine, a choice that had been based on what he later described as gut instinct when debriefed. "Here," Sarah said, showing him the data visualization. "Your algorithm, my algorithm, predicted the hostiles' next move based on their previous behavioral patterns. It calculated that they would expect you to descend. By climbing, you created a position where you had superior energy and angle of attack. You made the right decision, Captain. My algorithm simply showed the mathematical reasoning behind why it was right." Rodriguez stared at the visualization for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "That decision kept Thompson alive. My wingman would have been shot down if I'd made the correct decision. And you're telling me that your algorithm would have made the same recommendation?" "It would have made exactly that recommendation," Sarah confirmed. "Not because it's smarter than you, but because you and it think in complementary ways. Your intuition captures patterns that your conscious mind can't fully articulate. My algorithm can articulate those patterns mathematically, validate them, and present them in a way that confirms what you already intuitively know. Rodriguez turned to face the observation room where his squadron waited. He walked slowly toward them, every eye tracking his movement. "This algorithm," he said, pointing back at Sarah, "just showed me something I didn't understand about myself. It showed me that my gut instinct has a mathematical foundation. It showed me that the decision I made that day, the decision that saved Thompson's life, wasn't luck. It was pattern recognition at a level I couldn't consciously explain." He turned back to Sarah, and this time his expression was transformed. The skepticism had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like respect. "We need this," he said simply, "not because we don't trust ourselves, but because we trust the mathematical analysis of why we're right." He extended his hand to her. Sarah shook it, and as she did, she felt something shift in the room, a fundamental change in the energy, in the possibility of what might come next. The Titan squadron didn't applaud. They didn't cheer. But in the space of a single handshake, they had moved from skepticism to acceptance. Sarah had just proven that man and machine could think together. And everything that came after would flow from that single moment of understanding. The alarms began at 2:47 a.m., their wailing penetrating even the soundproofed walls of the officers' quarters where Sarah had finally collapsed after 12 straight hours of algorithm integration and pilot briefings. She bolted upright, adrenaline flooding her system with such violence that her vision momentarily blurred. Military alarms meant one thing: something real was happening. She threw on clothes and ran toward the Tactical Operations Center, her security credentials allowing her past checkpoints that would have stopped most civilians. The corridor was controlled chaos, pilots sprinting toward the ready room, maintenance crews mobilizing toward the flight line, command personnel moving with the urgent but controlled efficiency of people trained for exactly this scenario. Colonel Webb intercepted her outside the operations center. His face was grim, all business. "We have an unidentified contact breaching restricted airspace at the northern border. Not a drill, not a simulation. Real radar contact, real trajectory heading toward populated areas. We're scrambling Titan Squadron." Sarah's heart stopped. This was exactly what she'd feared and hoped for simultaneously. Live operational testing, under the worst possible circumstances, with actual lives depending on her algorithm's performance. "Are they going to?" Sarah began. "With full algorithmic integration," Webb confirmed. "You wanted real-world validation. You're getting it." The Tactical Operations Center was a cathedral of screens and communications equipment, dozens of personnel monitoring various aspects of the scramble. Sarah was escorted to a secured station where her algorithms could feed data directly to the pilots' F-22s. Around her, officers called out status updates in the practiced shorthand of military operations. "Titan 1, cleared for immediate takeoff," came the voice of the air traffic controller, crisp and professional. Rodriguez's F-22 screamed down the runway, afterburners painting the desert night with brilliant orange flame. Sarah watched on her monitors as his aircraft lifted off, followed in rapid succession by 3 wingmen. The formation accelerated to combat speed, climbing toward 30,000 feet where the unidentified contact was last tracked. "Contact is maintaining course," reported the radar officer. "Bearing 042, altitude 28,000 feet, speed 600 knots. Trajectory indicates possible incursion into civilian airspace within 8 minutes. Sarah's hands trembled as she activated her algorithm's real-time processing protocols. This was the moment she'd prepared for, the moment when her code would either save lives or fail catastrophically in the most visible way possible. Data streamed across her screens: radar information, satellite imagery, electronic emissions analysis, everything the military's detection systems could gather about the unidentified contact. Her algorithm began processing at inhuman speed, analyzing the aircraft's behavior, predicting its intentions, calculating optimal intercept vectors. Titan 1, I'm feeding you tactical recommendations, Sarah transmitted directly to Rodriguez's aircraft. Her voice was steady, though her insides felt like they were disintegrating. Unidentified contact is maintaining steady course. Recommend immediate bank to 023 degrees, maintain current altitude, advance intercept vector by 3 nautical miles. There was a fractional pause, Rodriguez processing the recommendation, deciding whether to trust the algorithm he'd barely accepted hours earlier with his life in actual combat. Copy that, Rodriguez's voice came back, calm and professional, banking to 023. The F-22 banked smoothly, its flight path adjusting exactly as Sarah's algorithm had suggested. The other 3 pilots in his formation followed, creating a coordinated intercept geometry that maximized tactical advantage while minimizing exposure. Tactical situation is evolving, Sarah continued, watching the radar traces converge. Recommend altitude adjustment, climb 2,000 feet, Rodriguez. The contact will attempt evasion at current altitude. By climbing, you'll maintain tactical superiority. Climbing to 30,000, Rodriguez acknowledged. Sarah held her breath as Rodriguez's aircraft ascended. On her screens, the unidentified contact's radar trace suddenly shifted, beginning an evasive maneuver at exactly the altitude where Rodriguez would have been if he'd maintained his previous flight path. Around the operations center, officers exchanged looks of shock. Sarah's algorithm had predicted the enemy's behavior before the enemy made the move. Contact is breaking left, Sarah transmitted. Recommend Rodriguez intercept from above left. Wingmen maintain flanking positions. All aircraft prepare for visual identification. What followed was a perfectly choreographed aerial ballet. 4 F-22 fighters moving with precision that seemed almost supernatural in its coordination. Sarah's algorithm was feeding constant updates, predicting every move the unidentified contact made, positioning the Titan squadron with such tactical perfection that the unknown aircraft had absolutely no escape route. Visual identification occurred at 5 nautical miles. The unidentified contact was a civilian transport aircraft, its transponder apparently malfunctioning, its pilots unaware they'd penetrated restricted airspace and were being intercepted by 4 combat fighters. Stand down from combat posture, Colonel Webb ordered into the communications net. This is a civilian aircraft with equipment failure. Titan Squadron, escort to nearest civilian airfield. Rodriguez's voice came over the channel, and Sarah could hear something in his tone that hadn't been there before, a profound respect for what they'd just accomplished together. Understood, sir. Civilian aircraft is responding to all signals. Transponder appears to be non-functional, but pilots are compliant. We'll maintain formation and escort them to designated landing zone. The tension in the operations center didn't immediately dissipate. People still moved with urgency, still tracked the unidentified, now identified, aircraft's flight path. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Sarah realized she was crying. Not from fear, though there had been plenty of fear. Not from relief, though relief was certainly part of it. She was crying because what she'd just witnessed was the validation of everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd devoted her life to achieving. For the first time, a human pilot and an artificial intelligence algorithm had executed a perfect combat intercept together, each complementing the other's capabilities, creating something greater than either could achieve alone. Colonel Webb appeared beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Your algorithm just prevented what could have been a civilian catastrophe, he said quietly. If that aircraft had penetrated further into civilian airspace, the response might have been far more violent. People could have died. It was already in civilian airspace by projection, Sarah whispered. My algorithm calculated that it would reach populated areas in 6 minutes, 53 seconds. We had to intercept now, not later." "Exactly," Webb said. "And you did, you and Rodriguez working together." 20 minutes later, the civilian aircraft safely landed at a nearby civilian airfield. The crew was already being briefed by federal officials about the implications of their transponder failure and unauthorized airspace incursion. In the grand scheme of international incidents, it was minor, a mechanical failure, a misunderstanding, nobody hurt, nobody killed. But to Sarah, it represented the moment when theory became reality, when mathematics transformed into life-saving action. Rodriguez and his squadron returned to base an hour later. The landing was smooth, professional, exactly what Sarah expected from pilots of his caliber. As the F-22s rolled to their hardened shelters, Sarah watched Rodriguez climb out of his cockpit, removing his helmet, his hair matted with sweat. He looked directly at her through the thick plexiglass of the observation window, and even from this distance, she could see the fundamental shift that had occurred in his perception of her. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of partnership, of respect earned through shared purpose under pressure. Sarah understood the message perfectly. The skepticism had been replaced by something far more powerful, trust built on tangible results, on the knowledge that her algorithm hadn't failed when everything was on the line. Operation Titan I had succeeded. And everything that came next would be defined by this moment of triumph. The debriefing room smelled like sweat, adrenaline, and the particular exhaustion that came from flying real combat operations. Rodriguez sat at the head of the conference table, still in his flight suit, his hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes that went deeper than simple lack of sleep. Sarah stood at the far end of the room, watching the pilots file in, all 4 members of the intercept team, along with Colonel Webb and various intelligence personnel who needed to document what had just occurred. Rodriguez barely looked at her. His jaw was clenched, his hands moving with restless energy as he tapped his fingers against the table in a rhythm that betrayed anxiety rather than confidence. This was not the confident warrior she'd seen in the cockpit hours earlier. This was a man wrestling with something internal, something that went beyond the tactical success they'd just achieved. An intelligence officer began the formal debriefing, walking through engagement parameters, aircraft identifications, communications logs. It was routine, procedural, the standard post-engagement documentation that the military conducted after every significant operation. Sarah paid attention while simultaneously noticing that Rodriguez wasn't really listening. His eyes kept drifting toward her, then away, as if he couldn't quite maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds. The formal debriefing concluded after 90 minutes. As people began gathering their materials and standing to leave, Rodriguez suddenly pushed back from the table with such force that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Major Chen," he said, his voice rough, "a word in private." Sarah followed him into a smaller conference room adjacent to the main debriefing space. Rodriguez closed the door behind them and stood for a long moment with his back to her, his shoulders heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. "That engagement today," he said finally, still not turning around, "was the most perfect aerial intercept I've ever participated in. Mathematically perfect, tactically flawless. Every move was optimized, every decision was enhanced by your algorithm's analysis." "Yes," Sarah said carefully, uncertain where this was heading. "Do you understand what that means?" Rodriguez finally turned to face her, and his eyes were red, glistening with unshed tears. "It means I've been flying wrong for 23 years. "No," Sarah said sharply, "that's not what it means at all." "It is," Rodriguez said, his voice breaking slightly. "Every engagement I've flown, every decision I made that I thought was perfect tactical genius born from decades of experience, today I learned that I could have done better. Every single time. If I'd had access to your algorithm, my pilots might not have died. Thompson's best friend wouldn't have been shot down over Iraq. Martinez wouldn't have been captured. Do you understand what you're telling me? Sarah's heart clenched. She hadn't known these details, hadn't understood the specific losses Rodriguez carried. Captain Rodriguez. They died because I made the best decisions I could with the information available to me, he continued, his voice now shaking with emotion he clearly couldn't contain. But now I know that the information available to me wasn't enough. Now I know that there was a better way, a mathematically superior approach to every engagement, and I didn't have access to it. Those men are dead because I didn't have your algorithm. No. Sarah moved toward him, her voice firm. Those men died because of enemy action, because of circumstances beyond your control, because warfare is unpredictable despite all our best efforts. My algorithm didn't exist when those engagements occurred. You can't blame yourself for not having access to something that hadn't been invented yet. Can't I? Rodriguez asked bitterly. I made decisions as a military officer, as a commander responsible for other people's lives. Today, I learned that my decisions could have been better. That knowledge doesn't erase the past, but it sure as hell makes the past hurt more. Sarah understood then what was happening. Rodriguez wasn't questioning her algorithm's value. He was grieving for the men he'd lost, for the possibility that different decisions might have changed outcomes, for the weight of command that she, as a civilian scientist, could never fully comprehend. Those pilots trusted you, Sarah said quietly. They flew with you because they believed in your judgment, and your judgment kept many of them alive. Your instinct, your experience, your tactical sense, those things weren't wrong. They were just incomplete without another layer of analysis. You weren't flying wrong. You were flying as well as you could with the tools available to you. Rodriguez sat down heavily in one of the conference chairs, his body suddenly looking exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. When you were showing me that simulation yesterday, when I realized that my gut instinct had mathematical validity, I understood something about myself I'd never recognized before. I realized that I've always been thinking mathematically. I just couldn't articulate it. My brain was doing complex calculations without my conscious mind realizing it. That's exactly right, Sarah said, sitting across from him. You've been running algorithms in your head for 23 years. What I've done is externalize that process, make it visible, allow you to understand the reasoning behind decisions you were making intuitively. And today, Rodriguez continued, when I heard your algorithm making recommendations in real time, when I felt my instinct confirming what your code was suggesting, something broke inside me, in a good way, but also in a terrifying way. I realized that the future of aerial combat isn't about pilots like me anymore. It's about pilots who can work with technology like yours. You're wrong, Sarah said firmly. Today proved the opposite. The future of aerial combat is about pilots like you who are willing to integrate with technology, who can recognize that working with artificial intelligence doesn't diminish their value, it multiplies it. Rodriguez looked at her, and slowly, the tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. They ran down his weathered face, mixing with sweat and exhaustion. When I was in that cockpit today, he said, his voice barely a whisper, I felt like I was flying better than I've ever flown. Not because I was doing something different, but because I was doing what I've always done, and your algorithm was confirming that I was right. It felt like having a trusted advisor in my head, someone who understood the mathematics beneath my intuition. That's exactly what I wanted to create, Sarah said. Not to replace you, to complement you, to enhance what you already are. Rodriguez wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that somehow managed to look both vulnerable and dignified. Those pilots you lost, Sarah said quietly. They died flying with the best tactical mind in the Titan Squadron. They died because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. But the work we're doing now, this algorithm, this integration of human and artificial intelligence, This might prevent other pilots from dying in similar circumstances. You can't change the past, Captain, but you can shape the future." Rodriguez was silent for a long moment. Then he stood and extended his hand to her. But this time, when he shook her hand, there was something different in the gesture. It wasn't the dismissive handshake of someone acknowledging a task completed. It was the grip of a warrior recognizing another warrior, someone who understood that Sarah had spent 6 years in her own form of combat, fighting against doubt, fighting to create something meaningful. "I'm going to request permanent integration of your algorithm into the Titan Squadron's operations," he said. "And I'm going to recommend to Colonel Webb that we push for full deployment across all operational squadrons." "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked. "I realized something," Rodriguez said, wiping away the last of his tears. "The algorithm doesn't diminish what I am, it amplifies it. And if amplifying what I am can save lives, then I'd be a fool to refuse." He paused at the door, then turned back. "Tomorrow morning, the entire squadron wants to talk to you about integration protocols, not as skeptics, as partners." When he left, Sarah sat alone in the empty conference room and finally let herself cry. Tears of relief, of validation, of understanding that the hardest battles aren't fought in the air or in laboratories. They're fought in the hearts of people learning to trust in something that challenges their fundamental understanding of themselves. 3 months after Operation Titan 1, Sarah had relocated her entire operation to Nelly's Air Force Base. What had started as a temporary deployment had become permanent. She'd been given a corner office in the command building with windows overlooking the flight line, a dedicated team of software engineers and military liaison officers, and an operational budget that had expanded by 400%. The quiet woman who'd arrived on a commercial flight, handcuffed to a briefcase, had become an integral part of the Titan Squadron's daily operations. The algorithm had been renamed the Titan Protocol, and its success had created a momentum that threatened to sweep across the entire Air Force. Requests for integration were pouring in from squadron commanders worldwide. Pilots who'd trained for decades to trust their own instincts were suddenly desperate to experience the enhancement that the Titan Protocol provided. Sarah's team was working 18-hour days just to manage the deployment requests, let alone implement the integration across multiple squadrons. But success, Sarah was learning, created enemies. General Marcus Hutchins arrived at Nelly's on a Tuesday morning with a security detail and an expression that suggested he'd eaten something that disagreed with him. He was the Deputy Director of Air Force Operations, which meant he had authority over tactical doctrine, squadron deployment, and resource allocation. More importantly, he had the ear of people who made decisions about technology implementation across the entire military apparatus. Sarah first learned of his concerns through a tense meeting with Colonel Webb in the secure operations room. Webb's face was grim as he handed her a classified report bearing Hutchins' signature. "He's proposing a moratorium on Titan Protocol expansion," Webb said without preamble. "He's claiming that we're moving too fast, that we haven't adequately tested the algorithm across diverse operational scenarios, that we're creating a dangerous dependency on artificial intelligence in combat situations." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Is he wrong?" Webb looked at her sharply. "What do you mean, is he wrong? You know the algorithm works." "The algorithm works when it's operated by experienced pilots like Rodriguez," Sarah said carefully. "But what about younger pilots? What about pilots who don't have the institutional knowledge to recognize when the algorithm's recommendations might be flawed? What about situations where the algorithm hasn't encountered similar scenarios in its training data?" "So you're agreeing with Hutchins?" Webb asked, his tone hardening. "I'm saying that Hutchins raises valid concerns," Sarah replied. "Not because the algorithm is flawed, but because implementing any new technology across a large military apparatus requires careful management, validation, and training. If we move too fast, If we deploy to pilots who aren't ready, we could create a situation where the algorithm's failure reflects poorly on the technology rather than on the implementation process. The conversation with Hutchins occurred 3 days later in a secure conference room at the Pentagon. Sarah was escorted by Colonel Webb and 2 senior officers from Air Force Research and Development. Hutchins was a tall man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire life in military hierarchy. He looked at Sarah with the kind of assessment that suggested he was calculating whether she was worth his time. "Major Chen," he began without any preamble, "your algorithm has achieved remarkable results with a single squadron of highly trained pilots. That's commendable, but I have concerns about broader deployment." "What kind of concerns?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. "First, dependency," Hutchins said, ticking off points on his fingers. "We're creating a generation of pilots who will become dependent on artificial intelligence to make tactical decisions. What happens when that system fails? What happens when a pilot hasn't flown without algorithmic assistance in months or years? We're destroying the fundamental decision-making independence that military training exists to instill." "The algorithm is designed to complement pilot decision-making, not replace it," Sarah responded. "Every recommendation can be overridden. Every tactical decision remains ultimately in the pilot's hands." "But will they override it?" Hutchins challenged. "Once pilots trust your algorithm, once they see it working reliably, won't they naturally defer to it? Won't your technology become a crutch that weakens military judgment?" Sarah had prepared for this argument. "General, that's like arguing that the introduction of radar systems weakened pilot decision-making. Pilots didn't become dependent on radar. They integrated it into their decision-making process. They trusted it when it was reliable and questioned it when something seemed wrong. The Titan protocol is just another tool in the arsenal." "A tool that thinks," Hutchins said sharply. "That's categorically different from radar. You're introducing artificial cognition into military operations. You're creating systems that can make decisions faster than humans can understand them. That's not tool integration. That's abdication of responsibility." The argument continued for 3 hours. Sarah presented data showing pilot performance improvements, safety metrics, engagement success rates. Hutchins countered with philosophical arguments about the nature of military judgment, about the importance of human accountability in warfare, about the dangers of creating a generation of warriors who delegated their thinking to machines. By the end of the meeting, Hutchins had made his position clear. He would support a limited expansion of the Titan protocol, but only if the program included mandatory pilot retraining, regular unplugged operational assessments where pilots flew without algorithmic assistance, and strict oversight protocols to prevent over-reliance on the system. "Furthermore," Hutchins said as the meeting concluded, "I want a civilian oversight committee established. If the military is going to integrate AI systems into combat operations, there needs to be external review of the ethical implications." Walking out of the Pentagon, Sarah felt simultaneously vindicated and exhausted. Hutchins wasn't trying to kill the program. He was trying to ensure it was implemented responsibly. And in her heart, Sarah knew he was right. The real war began after that Pentagon meeting. Not a war against Hutchins. She quickly realized they were actually allies in demanding responsible implementation, but a war against the momentum that threatened to outpace wisdom. Sarah worked with Hutchins' office to develop comprehensive deployment protocols. She created training programs that taught pilots how to integrate with the algorithm rather than depend on it. She established regular assessments where pilots had to demonstrate competency flying without the protocol. She submitted to inspections, allowed military auditors into her code, accepted limitations, and oversight that she might have resisted a year earlier. Colonel Webb watched this transformation with something like amazement. "You're fighting for restrictions on your own technology." he observed during one late-night session where Sarah was reviewing deployment protocols. "No," Sarah corrected. "I'm fighting for smart expansion of my technology." Hutchins was right about one thing: we were moving too fast. We were so excited about the algorithm's success that we were risking implementing it in ways that could undermine its value. If we deploy to unprepared pilots, if we create dependency rather than enhancement, if we don't maintain human judgment as the ultimate authority, then we actually do damage the military's decision-making capability. The Titan protocol's expansion slowed, becoming more methodical, more careful, but it also became more sustainable. As Sarah worked with Hutchins' Oversight Committee, she realized something profound. The general wasn't opposed to artificial intelligence in military operations. He was opposed to artificial intelligence in military operations that wasn't properly integrated into existing military culture and values. 6 months into the oversight process, Hutchins called Sarah personally. "I'm recommending full approval for expanded deployment across 23 squadrons," he said without preamble. "Your retraining protocols work. Your unplugged assessment procedures are rigorous. And your willingness to accept oversight suggests you understand the stakes involved here." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "Don't thank me yet," Hutchins replied. "This is just the beginning. The real challenge is implementing this responsibly across a military institution that's been trained to think one way for 70 years. But you've proven you understand that challenge. That matters." When Sarah hung up the phone, she realized something had shifted inside her. She wasn't just a computer scientist who'd created an algorithm anymore. She was an architect of military doctrine, a bridge between technological possibility and institutional wisdom, a voice arguing for both innovation and responsibility. The new war doctrine was being written, not in the sky but in policy papers and training protocols. And Sarah Chen was helping to write it. 5 years later, Major Sarah Chen stood in the Pentagon's underground war room, watching the Titan protocol operate across 53 active fighter squadrons in real time. The displays showed engagement data, pilot performance metrics, algorithmic recommendations flowing through the neural networks of the most advanced air defense system ever created. Every screen represented lives saved. Every data point represented a decision that had been enhanced, improved, made more lethal against threats to American interests. The statistics were staggering enough to numb her. Defense efficiency up 340%, pilot survival rates increased by 89%, hostile incursions intercepted without a single friendly casualty in operational theaters where the protocol was deployed. 12 nations had formally requested licensing agreements to integrate the Titan protocol into their own air forces. 3 more had begun covert attempts to reverse engineer her code, something that kept the Pentagon's cybersecurity division working around the clock. But as Sarah moved through the corridors of power, attending congressional hearings, briefing the National Security Council, defending her work against critics who still worried about the militarization of artificial intelligence, she found herself increasingly hollow. The accolades were extraordinary. She'd been promoted to major, given command of her own directorate, offered positions at every major technology company and defense contractor in America. Universities had named buildings after her. Think tanks had published hundreds of papers analyzing her work. Yet none of it filled the void that had opened inside her when she realized the full implications of what she'd created. The congressional testimony came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The House Armed Services Committee had convened to review the Titan protocol's performance and consider appropriations for the next fiscal year. Sarah sat at a table facing representatives from every demographic, political persuasion, and ideological position. Some viewed her as a visionary who'd revolutionized military capability. Others saw her as the architect of a dystopian future, where machines made decisions about human life and death. Representative Diana Okonkwo, A congresswoman from Ohio with a reputation for penetrating questions leaned forward with an intensity that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. Major Chen, Okonkwo began, over the past 5 years, the Titan Protocol has been involved in 847 tactical engagements. In how many of those engagements did the algorithm make a recommendation that the pilot ultimately rejected? Sarah had anticipated the question. Approximately 3.2% of all recommendations were overridden by pilot judgment. And in how many of those cases where the pilot overrode the algorithm, did the pilot's decision result in a better tactical outcome than the algorithm's recommendation would have produced? Sarah hesitated. This was the question that haunted her, the question she'd spent countless nights analyzing with her team. In approximately 0.8% of cases, she answered quietly. In 2.4% of cases, the pilot's override and the algorithm's recommendation produced equivalent outcomes. In the remaining cases, the algorithm's original recommendation would have been superior. The implications hung in the air like a suspended blade. The algorithm was right 99.2% of the time when pilots second-guessed it. For most practical purposes, that meant pilot judgment was statistically irrelevant once the algorithm had made a recommendation. So we're spending billions of dollars training fighter pilots, Okonkwo continued, when the algorithm you designed is almost always right. No, Sarah said, and her voice carried the weight of 5 years of wrestling with this exact problem. We're training pilots to understand when the algorithm might be wrong. The 0.8% of cases where human judgment proved superior often occurred in situations where the algorithm had limited precedent in its training data, where circumstances were genuinely novel, where intuition and experience could perceive patterns that mathematical models couldn't capture. Human pilots remain essential not because they're usually right, but because they're sometimes right in ways that algorithms can't be. After the hearing, as Sarah was being escorted from the Capitol, an aide pulled her aside with a message. Rodriguez wanted to see her. He was in Arlington Cemetery, where he visited regularly, visits that Sarah had never fully understood until recently. She found him standing before a grave marker bearing the name Thompson, David R., Captain, United States Air Force. Rodriguez was in civilian clothes, his expression contemplative in the way that suggested he'd been standing there for quite some time. He would have liked what you've accomplished, Rodriguez said without preamble. Thompson always believed that technology and warfare were inevitably intertwined. He used to say that fighting the future was like fighting gravity, ultimately futile. Sarah stood beside him, reading the inscription on the grave. Thompson had been Rodriguez's wingman, the man whose life Rodriguez believed had been saved by the algorithm during their combat engagement 3 years ago. I've been thinking about something, Rodriguez continued. When we first met, I resisted your algorithm because I thought it threatened what I was, a pilot, a warrior, someone who relied on instinct and experience. But over the years, I've come to understand something different. The algorithm didn't diminish what I was. It clarified it. It showed me that everything I thought was intuition had mathematical foundations. Everything I thought was experience had patterns that could be analyzed and improved. I'm not sure that's comforting, Sarah said quietly. No, Rodriguez agreed, but it's true. And Thompson's legacy, the reason I come here regularly, is to remind myself that the work we're doing matters. Not because it makes warfare easier or cleaner, it doesn't. But because it might mean fewer graves like this one. That's all we can ever hope to achieve. They stood in silence for several minutes, 2 warriors in their own ways, one who'd spent her life in a laboratory, one who'd spent his life in cockpits, recognizing that they'd fundamentally altered the nature of aerial combat. Later that evening, Sarah received a call from General Hutchins, now the Director of Air Force Operations. He'd been following the congressional hearing and wanted to discuss something classified. We've had a situation develop, he said carefully. a hostile engagement in a contested region where 3 allied nations are involved. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, and we're considering military intervention. But before we make that decision, I want your assessment of whether the Titan Protocol is ready for large-scale multinational operations. Sarah's heart sank. She'd always known this moment would come, the moment when her creation would be tested against real enemies in real warfare, not simulations or routine interceptions. "It's never fully ready," she said finally, "but it's as ready as it's ever going to be. The algorithm has learned from thousands of scenarios. It's been integrated into pilot training across multiple nations. But General, you need to understand that deploying this in actual warfare means accepting the possibility of failure on a scale we haven't experienced before." "I understand," Hutchins said, "but the alternative is deploying without the Titan Protocol, which means accepting higher casualty rates among our pilots and allied forces. Sometimes, Major, the choice isn't between perfection and failure. It's between different kinds of risk." 2 weeks later, as Sarah watched military engagement data streaming across her screens from active combat operations, she experienced something that felt like clarity and devastation simultaneously. The Titan Protocol was performing flawlessly, interdicting hostile aircraft, protecting friendly forces, preventing enemy attacks with such efficiency that the Allied coalition was winning without significant losses. But with each successful interception, each hostile contact eliminated, Sarah understood that she'd become something she'd never intended to be. Not just a computer scientist, not just an engineer. She'd become a creator of weapons systems, an architect of military doctrine, a voice shaping how wars were fought at the most fundamental level. That night, standing alone in her Pentagon office overlooking the city, Sarah thought back to that flight from San Francisco, that quiet woman in seat 12F carrying technology that would change everything. She'd believed she was creating a tool to save lives, and perhaps she had. But she'd also created something else, a system that made warfare more efficient, more lethal, more divorced from the human cost of violence. Rodriguez called late that evening. "You should know," he said, "that the engagement we just conducted, the one using full Titan Protocol integration, resulted in 0 friendly casualties. 3 hostile aircraft were intercepted without a single pilot loss on either side." "That's good news," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is good news," Rodriguez affirmed. "And it's your legacy, Sarah. You didn't just change how we fly. You changed what's possible in warfare. Whether that's ultimately good or bad, well, that's not your decision to make alone anymore. But you've proven that humans and machines can work together in ways we never imagined possible." After he hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her office, watching the lights of Washington, D.C. spread out below her like a constellation. Somewhere in that city, decisions were being made about how to use the tools she'd created. Somewhere in the world, pilots were flying with her algorithm, saving lives or ending them depending on circumstances beyond anyone's control. And Sarah Chen, the quiet woman from seat 12F, understood finally that legacy isn't about intention. It's about impact, and her impact on the world would echo across decades, reshaping the nature of warfare itself. Whether that was progress or tragedy, only history would ultimately decide. The end.